Kill the monsters when they're small. Get ahead of these things. Dedicate time to these conversations. Figure out what the person in front of you needs. Figure out what's the button that somebody's going to push, because we all have them. And then coach them. And how do they separate response from impulse, right? When this happens, how can I help you get ahead of that? So when that moment comes, you're going to respond in a way that's useful to you and the people around you, not harmful. Invest time in these conversations now. It's going to save you down the road.
Hello and welcome to the Unlock Lab. I'm your host, Tosca DiMatteo, and I am so thrilled that you're here. Today, we're going to talk about how you can lead so people love to follow. This is an interview with Brian Rollo, an amazing leader, coach, and consultant who helps individuals and organizations with their leadership needs and challenges. This episode is for anybody who wants to up-level their life, honestly, whether you lead other people, whether you are an individual contributor, you're an entrepreneur, or maybe you're even on break. These principles that we talk about today are helpful in life and in leadership. So stay tuned, because I think there's so much here for you to take away. And Brian shares several tools that are available to you in the show notes. So please be sure to take a look at those and reach out to Brian. He is going to enhance your life, I am sure. So without any further ado, let's jump in. Brian, first of all, thank you so much for being here. I know you are a busy guy. You are an author, you're a leader, you are a speaker, you are a consultant and coach. You do all the things. And why I'm so excited to talk to you is, yes, all of these topics around leadership that you have crafted such an expertise around, but more so having the opportunity to get to know you when we were together in a professional environment for 2 solid days, and just getting to know how much this matters to you, to learn what an amazing listener you are, and that you are just such a generous, kind soul. That's really part and parcel why I'm excited to have this conversation, because I've started to see the heart of you, and I know that whoever's listening is just going to get so much out of it. So thank you.
Tosca, thank you for the kind words. I've been looking forward to this for a long time, and same right back to you. So we met at the Phil Jones Mastermind, right?
Yep.
Shout out to Phil Jones. I just knew right from the very beginning, I loved your story. I loved what you shared, and it's super exciting to be able to chat with you like this. So thank you for the invitation.
Oh, my pleasure. And I'm excited to dive deep into the topics that you teach around leadership. But before we go into all that, I would love for the audience to hear about your career journey. I know you've had a lot of twists and turns. And personally, I love to hear about that pursuit that when you're in it can be really hard, but when you can look back, it's really inspiring. So share a little bit about you, whatever you want to share about you and your career journey, your personal journey. Yeah, let our audience get to know you a bit more.
Yeah, thank you for the invitation. I normally don't talk about this all that much, but I appreciate your opportunity to do so. So long story, somewhat short, my first real job was at a bank. And my biggest strategy behind that was because I knew somebody at a bank. And they said, oh, this would be good for you. That was my first ever job. And they brought me in at the bottom level you could ever come in at. Figure that. And then after a little while, they said, Brian, we know just where we want to put you. And they put me in the loan collection department. So for several years, that's what I did. My job was calling up people who hadn't paid their loans. And then they gave me a promotion, air quotes to the listeners, a promotion to be the repo man. So that was my job at the bank for many years. I was the guy who would go out and knock on people's doors or call them. And even if somebody couldn't pay their bill, I would be the guy out there to go have to get their car. And sometimes it was all sort of subterfuge and sneaking around at night and getting keys made up. It was this whole crazy, crazy thing. So that was my job for several years. I could see a shocked face. I don't know if we ever talked about that before.
No, we didn't. And I'm like, oh my gosh, this sounds so antithetical to who you are as just a kind, generous. But was it really hard for you, or was it this is what I have to do? How did you feel about doing that?
It was hard because basically, if you're in that job, you're operating when you're talking to people on one of two main emotions. One, either this person has really irritated you because they've lied to you time after time again, and you know that they're just sort of gaming you. Or more often, there's just a real sense of empathy. And, you felt bad for people, and nobody liked to be the guy to have to do that. I didn't. Like you said, it wasn't part of my nature. What I learned, Tosca, from that, and it actually helped me later on, is that there's two ways to do that job, right? One is the tough, intimidating approach. I'm going to scare you into doing what I want you to do. The other way is to learn how to talk to people in high conflict situations. Like, how do you talk to somebody who's very emotional and very upset? How do you talk to somebody who definitely does not want to do what you're asking them to do? And to be able to help them see that maybe that is the best path forward. So that was the second route, was the way I went more. So it actually, in a weird way, taught me a lot about how to deal with people in difficult situations, which was a skill set that ended up paying off later on.
Oh my gosh, this is like such a beautiful like origin story of leadership. But thank you for the allowing for a little deep dive there. Okay, so what next?
So I'll tell you a little messy story about this if you like. I did this
Oh, we
job
love the mess.
for
Sorry, we love the mess.
for many years. Again, this is sort of vulnerable. I don't feel happy, proud of saying this, but it's the truth. So I did this job for several years, and it came to wear on me, as you can imagine it would, because this is all day, every day. There's no such thing as a day or even an hour without conflict. Like this is the job, and it was very difficult. And at the same time, part of me started to get almost a little resentful. I remember that, the bank I worked at would have these big company retreats and award things. And the funny thing is, people outside called me a banker. Brian, he's a banker. But to be honest, I was a banker about as much as the custodian was a banker. I had nothing to do with people's money or savings accounts or anything like that. Like, nothing to do with me. And I remember going to these events. They would award like these high performer awards for the people who did the most for the company. And it would be all these people who, in my viewpoint, sat in these offices and pushed papers around, and they kept getting these awards. I'm like, who out there is, getting knives waved at them? And I started to get almost like a little bitter, because I thought, listen, I'm out here like literally risking my welfare, and it's invisible and it's not fair. And I started to feel a little sorry for myself, honestly. So around that time, I ended up coming across some what we might call now self-development books. I didn't know that, but they really helped me change my approach and see how my approach had been. Maybe I'd find out a good way to talk to these people in these difficult situations. I hadn't been really thinking about it strategically from a career standpoint. And I realized, Brian, if you don't want to keep repoing cars for the next 40 years, you better figure out another approach. And in fact, you don't have to keep doing this if you don't want to. It's up to you. You're not a victim of circumstances. You control your destiny. So that really changed my viewpoint and changed the way I looked at the people around me and careers in general, and really springboarded my growth to eventually leave that behind to other things that were more, I think, attuned to my authenticity and really helped me grow my career.
Oh my gosh, I love that you shared that for a number of reasons. Number one, like that you looked at yourself first and foremost. You started going into that resentment and blaming and all those things. And then to say, okay, wait a minute, what can I do? And I think that's so much of like what I talk about on this platform, which is like, yeah, like the world is messed up. Yep, we can be in situations that we don't want to be in, and we cannot control how other people treat us and all the things. But what we can do is take a look at how am I showing up? And is there something I can do that allows me to show up in an even better way? And then not only that, but then taking it to the action part, right? Which is like we can talk about it in our heads or we can read the book. But until we actually action, what am I doing differently when I show up to work? Or what am I telling myself that's different? Or that's where the real work is, and the real transformation is where it starts. So I love that you took those steps in a very early on in your career.
Yeah, I didn't have a coach Tosca back then. I could have used one, but I was the guy that, if somebody said self-development or personal growth back then, I probably would have rolled my eyes. And if people roll their eyes at me today when I say those words, like, I get it to some point, but I really came to realize that, like, closing your mind to that was really cutting myself off, and that there were ways that I could again, customize my approach, the way I interacted with people, and really make things better for myself and hopefully the people around me.
Yes. It's funny, like the things we resist, right? And I think that even for you listening, when you hear the word personal development, like what is that? And if you feel resistance and if you're rolling your eyes, it's like the very starting place can be what is the resistance that you feel around these topics or anything that we end up talking about today. Okay, so what next? So you started doing things a little differently and moved your career in a new direction. And where did it go?
So I started this new approach. I realized I didn't have to walk around being mad all the time, and that like I could strategically create relationships and develop skills. That was the other part that I hadn't been doing. I was sort of bitter that these other people had these opportunities, but I hadn't done much to build the skills that they had. So I realized there was a little bit more that I could do there that way. So long story short, somebody at one point came along. I still don't know why they did it. And they said, Brian, yeah, you're the repo man, but we want to make you a branch manager. They threw me in a branch and put me in front of people who didn't need to have their cars repossessed. And then, that was a big change. And again, I'm thankful to those people today because I still look back and say, why did they hire me of all the people they could have put in that position? Because I knew nothing about that world, but they did. And that really gave me the opportunity, again, to learn how to talk to people in different circumstances. I ended up being asked to go behind the scenes and run the retail part side of the bank, help run that. Eventually got asked to create a leadership program for the bank, ended up taking over the whole training for the company. And one thing I'll tell you, Tosca, and again, I say this hopefully with enough humility that comes across. But I remember I told you I was so bitter about those awards. I ended up sort of setting a company record. I won that high performer award 4 times in 4 different jobs that nobody had ever done. So it just,
Wow.
again, that's not to say talk anything good about myself or highlight myself. It's just to show what a new mindset can do.
Yeah, totally. And I think the other piece is it is really easy to be jealous of others, right? And envious and all of those things. And I always say that there's so much information in that. What does that mean that I want? Does it mean I want recognition? Does it mean that I want to feel like I'm doing something that matters for this organization? So rather than stuff that feeling down, I've come to learn to really investigate, well, what is it that's saying that I want or that I'm seeking. And so yeah, no, I love that you shared that. And the power of shifting how you show up is magical and expansive. And it's like I love hearing like those concrete stories of really the proof is in the pudding of making those shifts really pay huge dividends.
Yeah. Thank you. And again, it really started with just a change in mindset. So that's that. And then again, long story, I guess it really hasn't been short at this point, but somewhat shorter than long. At some point, we might delve into this more too. I came to think, Brian, what if you took these skills you had around leadership? Again, I've been asked to create a leadership program for the company. I put like 100 people through it, more, I guess, and got to see what really worked and helped people and what was sort of fluff and not very helpful, and decided to sort of take that show on the road, so to speak, and start my own company doing just that. So that's sort of the journey that got me to where I get to sit with you today.
Yes, yes. And I love you talk about like removing the fluff and really getting to the core of the content that's going to serve people. And it makes me wonder being in leadership yourself, having created training around it, how do you define leadership actually?
That's a great question. This is where I start almost every leadership conversation with, whether it's a keynote, whether it's a workshop, whether it's coaching, because it seems like a simple enough question. But I found if we can't decide on an answer to that question, we're never going to be on the same path. So to me, leadership is very, very, very almost stunningly simple in the end. Now, I've done this before. Maybe you've done it. People have gone to workshops. They said, what is leadership? Tell me some qualities of a leader. And you can spend half an hour on it, 45 minutes, talking about all these theoretical things. But in my experience, it all boils down to one thing. Leadership is about taking somebody else or seeing somebody else that is in one state, a less than optimal state, and guiding them to a better state. That is it. That is leadership. If you want to say you have led somebody, you have to do it. It's part of the process. You have to help somebody or guide somebody from where they are to where they want to be, or maybe where it is best for everybody that they get to. So that's why I sort of call my methodology point to point leadership, as you know, because it goes around the simple thing. Somebody's at one point, I help them get to another point. When we can do that, we have said we led. So when I define leadership, I don't go into all the qualities of leadership, and leaders are courageous and they're personable, and all these things that many leaders, these qualities that many great leaders have, aren't a definition of leadership at the end of the day. The definition is, have I led somebody? And if I can do that, some of these other qualities that we talk about when we talk about leadership are going to be very useful, but they aren't leadership themselves.
Oh, yes. And I love that definition, right? Doesn't require that you have any direct reports. It doesn't require that you're actually managing others. And then it goes beyond even your job and career. It's every aspect of your life you can show up and lead and be a leader. And what it made me think of as well is this idea of helping somebody get from one point to another point. And I'm curious what you think about this. Is it your objective of where they need to be, or is it based on where they want to go? Or is it a combination of both? Because maybe they can't see what's in everybody's best interest or their best interest. Like, where it's kind of like, this idea of coaching and helping people find the answers to their questions versus mentoring or, leading the witness.
Yeah, I think it can be both, and it is both. One of the other things you'll hear me say a lot, Tosca, is leadership is situational. So I always try to keep that in mind whenever I get the urge to be definitive about something, about leadership, or definitive to an approach. It's always situational. Anytime you're leading, that implies working with somebody else, working with a complex human who has their own biases, emotions, history, that they're their own unique person, and likely a unique circumstances involving other people. So it's always situational. So it always takes some thought in saying, what's going on here and what's the best approach? So the answer to your question is, I think it can be both. Sometimes leadership is somebody saying, hey, I need to get here. Can you help me? I come to Coach Tosca and say, Coach Tosca, I want to do X, Y, Z. You guide me to that. That's leadership. Sometimes, especially with my corporate clients, you could have somebody who's even resistant to it, right? A manager could have somebody on their team that doesn't want to do what they need to do to fulfill the job. A good leader is going to guide them to that result. Hopefully, ideally, at the end, that person realizing the growth has been good for them, good for the company, good for the team.
Yeah. And there's a few things that I just want to pull out from what you're saying, especially in the time that we're living in, right? In terms of context and situation and what we may have done 6 months ago or a year ago versus what's happening now, and how especially certain folks are impacted more than others. And how do we take that into account in terms of leading? And also, you bring up this idea of resistance, right? Like that maybe you've been asked to work with folks that are just like, well, I don't want to do the things. And so I'm curious your perspective on, when do you say when? Because I think that a lot of folks are in a situation where they're feeling like, I can't do anything, or I can't influence, or like people aren't changing, and, all of that kind of mentality. And some people aren't ready, right? That's just the truth. So what's your gauge? Like if a leadership team is like, hey, I want you to work with this person, and that person is resistant, how do you determine if that's not going to get to the outcomes that everybody's wanting?
Again, without repeating myself, like it's situational. So if we're talking about a corporate thing, that's one thing. If we're talking about somebody says, I want to influence this family member, right? You're not going to fire the family member, right? Which is sort of
Right.
have the option to do in the corporate world if things go really poorly. So I think it depends on the situation. Here's what I have found. When we have people that are resistant in the corporate setting, in a business setting, and it's my job to influence them, it's your job to influence them, we need to try to figure out fairly quickly, is this a skills issue or is this an attitude issue, right? Because a lot of times people do want to do it, but they don't have the skills, or they don't even know that they can have the skills. Like, think about me back in my repo man days. Somebody could have said, Brian, you have the ability to do this. I would have said, no, I don't. I can't never do that. So it needed, in this case, it was from books, but it could have been a person. And if I think about it, there were people that did help me along that line. They said, hey, Brian, you can. And it didn't happen overnight, but it was the process. To answer your question, I think a leader needs to have really good conversations with people, which again is the heart of the point-to-point leadership framework, and determine quickly, is this an attitude issue? I refuse to do it, or is this I'm afraid to do it, or I'm not confident enough to do it, or I don't know where to start in order to get the skills to be able to do it, because we can work with those.
Yes. The way that I usually think about what you're kind of talking about is process versus people. And what I love is that there's work to do to get under the surface, to get under the resistance, to say, let me really understand what's happening here with this individual so that I know what that next step is to really pressure test what's possible and how I can help that person. So I'd love to hear more about the point to point framework and introduce the audience to this as a tool to how to move the needle and lead.
Yeah. Can I tell you a little story that might help you understand?
Yes, please.
So I sort of skipped or part of my journey, but I think that your listeners might find it helpful to hear this. So I told you I was running this department over in retail of this bank, helping run the whole department, which was, I don't know, a couple hundred people. And I had 30 or so direct reports. And I had an assistant manager named Kimberly. So Kimberly was the kind of person, Tosca, if you ever worked with somebody that sort of just is like the perfect person for you, right? You get along great. Their strengths sort of offset where you aren't as strong, and hopefully you do the same for them. It was just a great fit. She was smart, funny, came to work every day with a positive attitude. I loved working with her. The team loved working with her. And it was just a great fit until one day when it all went south. And my manager called me in and said, Brian, Kimberly made this mistake. She said something to a team member she shouldn't have said. You need to talk to her and make sure she never does that again. And you tell her if she does that again, she's out of here. So this sort of took me by surprise, Tosca, and I understood the assignment, but there was only one problem. I had no idea how to deliver that kind of message and make it work. I was a bull in a china shop. Like, I did not have the skills to do that. But of course, I didn't let that stop me. My manager told me to do it. So I do it. And I called Kimberly in and I sort of told her what my manager said. Listen, this situation happened. And by the way, she did say something without a doubt that she should not have said. And she admitted that to me, but she tried to explain the context a little bit because there was more to the story. But at that point, I wasn't hearing it because I was trying to do what my boss told me to do. Tosca, I was trying to be a good employee. She said, deliver the message, be tough, Brian. So that's what I tried to do. And she tried to tell me more about why it happened. And I wasn't hearing that. I said, yeah, Kimberly, here's the bottom line. You do it again, you're out of here. And I'll never forget, she got out of that meeting, went up to leave the office, and she looked back at me. And if I had to describe the emotions in her face, Tosca, it was like part hurt, part like anger for sure, and maybe even part betrayal. And it was one of those moments, I don't know if you've ever had one of these, where like I knew then there was no going back, right? I knew then that relationship was forever changed. And she walked out that door. This was like on a Tuesday after like several days of barely saying anything. She, on Friday afternoon at 5 p.m., walks by my desk, slaps a piece of paper on it, and just keeps going. You can probably guess what that piece of paper was, right? It was a resignation.
Yeah.
So she was going to leave not only the company, but to go to work for our biggest competitor. And she went on to have a great career. But I knew then, after a little bit of self-reflection, like I can't keep doing things this way. If I want to be successful in this new role, and again, think about me before, the repo man, I didn't have to rely on anybody else. I was just me. But now I had to be able to influence other people. And this was a new skill set for me, and one which clearly I was not prepared for in every circumstance. So I knew then, Brian, you have to be able to do this better. You have to be able to like lead in a way that people will accept, they'll understand, and even want to follow. Although they might not like any conversation, like they'll want to work for you. And I've since evolved that into like they'll love to follow, because want is temporary. But somebody who loves their job, not necessarily loves me as a leader or you as a leader, but they love their job, even though there's tough days, they get fulfillment from it. They believe in the mission. They believe in what they're doing. That's what we're aiming for, I think. And I needed to figure out a way to get there because clearly I wasn't.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. I so appreciate that you shared that story. And I know that's such a big part of why you're passionate about giving people the tools and creating the frameworks. It's such a good reminder that like leading is messy. Like
Yeah.
it's, and that we do make mistakes and that that's okay. And it's also about learning from it and making a new choice should we ever have the opportunity.
Yeah, definitely. And I would add to that, Tosca, the more I thought about it, the more aware I became of the potential impact I had on people. Because while I agree with your idea, we're going to make mistakes, that was not okay. Right? That affected a lot of people. It
Right.
affected Kimberly. She had to go get a new job. She was really good at this. It affected her family. Like her kids had to go to a new daycare because her new job was farther away. It affected the people on my team because they loved her. The more I thought about the ripple effects of me being bad at this, the more I realized how much I needed to change. This is why I'm so passionate, is because unfortunately, what I come across a lot in the corporate world, not all the time, but a lot, is this idea that, you know what, you learn how to manage people, you learn how to lead people by trial and error, right? Tasha's a good performer. We'll make her a manager. She'll figure out the people stuff by trial and error. The only problem with that is your errors are costly, not just for yourself, but for the company and for the people you work with.
Right.
There's no other way to do it without having a few guinea pigs that things don't go well for. Right? That is not a great, in my mind, is not a great way to lead. So that's why I come in. My whole point is, again, to try to help people sort of skip the line, getting past some of those mistakes we don't have to make.
Yes. And that makes sense. Like what I'm hearing in what you're saying, Brian, right, is like that as a leader, part of this is about taking responsibility that you have an impact, that it matters how you work with people and lead people, that there's big ripple effects, and that the damage can be long lasting in certain situations, not just for the individual impacted, but for the organization and all that good stuff. So that there's this idea of, well, we can't just say, well, I'm going to live and learn and make some mistakes, but rather what I'm hearing you say is the more proactive you can be in making sure that you're not making these costly mistakes. And at the same time, it's easy to be in judgment of ourselves when we do. And then that creates other challenges. But at least
Yeah.
if you're proactive and you're saying, let me figure this out before I'm in a situation, or let me test out some things, or let me role play some difficult conversations before I'm in it, then at least you're making less of those mistakes, which of course are gonna also happen.
Yeah. And so you raise a great point. I think the downstream effect of this is if a manager, in my experience, or a leader, an executive, anybody is sort of, again, if we're going to talk about formal control in a business setting, once they realize the impact they have, there's sort of two options. One is just, I don't care. And this is easier and a shortcut because it's always faster for you to order somebody to do something. It's faster, right?
Right.
I don't have to talk and talk about, challenges. I don't have to coach. It's just do it or you're fired. The
Right.
approach I took, it's always faster. It's way worse in the long run, not only for people, but for the company. Financially, it's going to be a really poor decision because you're going to alienate your best people. But the other approach I almost see this more, Tosca, is somebody realizes the impact they're having on people and they almost retreat as leaders, right?
Mm,
If having this conversation can potentially hurt somebody, I'm just not going to do it, right? I'm just going to sort of, the phrase you hear a lot is hands off leader, which I appreciate to some extent, but I find that often translates into an absent leader, right?
mm.
They go to their office, they just want to stick their head in the sand and pretend everything's fine because they don't have the language or the skills to have these types of conversations with people. So the solution is, I just won't have them.
Right. Yeah. And yes, just as detrimental on many levels. And I think there's a lot more awareness of this now, but how there's this legacy of being told how to lead, of directing other people to lead in the way that you lead, which gets to leadership style stuff, but also leads to, I think, people leading in a way that's not authentic to who they are and doesn't lean on their strengths. And so I'm curious your thoughts about all of this because what I heard in your story about Kimberly was like you were told how to lead and you followed those exact instructions, which wasn't your style.
So I'm thinking of two things, if I can say them both. The first, which is not directly with the question you asked, but I think sort of implied, is it's always helpful for me to sort of think of the evolution of what we might call leadership in business over the past, I don't know, say 100 years. Because I still get, I'll bet you run across these people too, Tosca, and I bet your listeners have, who still say, listen, all this leadership stuff is hooey, all this conversation. I'm just going to tell them what to do and they'll do it. If they want to keep getting paid, they should do it. Like that's the extent of how they think about leadership. And to be fair, like if you go back to the Industrial Revolution, that could be a pretty successful approach back then. Because if my job is just to turn the dial on this machine 200 times an hour, and that's all I get measured by, I don't really have to be that motivated or that thoughtful about it, right? My boss can just say, did you turn it 200 times or not? And that's about as far as it goes. But in the work we do today, that increasingly requires collaboration, requires people skills, requires creativity, requires the ability to be able to have great communication with clients, customers, team members. That approach does not work anymore. And if it does work, it only works to the very minimum acceptable level.
Well, and I can't help but because we're seeing a lot of what you just explained in the highest levels of government right now, which just exacerbates, right? And that can be very triggering because we've done so much work to show a better way, and old habits die hard. I don't know. I just
So can I jump back in on that?
Yeah.
So I agree with everything you just said 100%, right? But I also found it very important that when I'm talking to people in business, to try again, because leadership is situational, right? There are still probably factories where somebody's job is to turn the crank 200 times an hour, right? And you can measure their success by that. So if that manager says, listen, I tell them what to do and they do it and it works for us, I'm not going to impose my moral thoughts on how they should lead or what's good for people on it, right? That is for them to figure out. My ultimate test is what's useful, right? What is the most useful approach? Is this approach working for you? So there may be some circumstances, some businesses where they can still go back to that old school way, do it or be fired. And it works okay. Do I think that's the best thing to do? Absolutely not. Do I think that's the best way to treat people? Absolutely not. But my job is to help people do what's the most useful thing for them. And I think in the vast majority of cases, you're going to see way better results leading it in a way that people buy in and they want to get better at the same time.
Well, and I think what the way that I kind of express what you're talking about is looking at our choices, not just in the short term, but in the long term, because maybe something is working in this moment, but is it going to work in the long term of your reputation as a leader, of people wanting to stay with you, of not finding incentive to leave because, all the things. And I think that because we get indoctrinated into short-term wins and short-term results, then we end up thinking about leadership in the short term. And that's not sustainable, in my opinion. I could get out a whole soapbox on this.
Well, yeah, one of the things, some of the language I use when people say who you work for, I always say thoughtful leaders and thoughtful companies. And they say, what does thoughtful mean? Define it, which is a great question. To me, I define it as the ability to see beyond the next quarter's results.
Oh, well, there you go. See, like simpatico.
Right. Exactly, because
love it.
And it's so easy to get caught in that trap, right? It is so easy. This is like capitalism, you're a publicly held company, you got to crank out those next quarter's results. And then the next quarter you have to do better. And I'm not denying that system at all. This is the game we play. But I found it most useful for most companies to have one eye on that, but another eye looking down the road. And be able to act in a way that's not going to generate just those short-term results, but the long-term results, which is going to involve, again, bringing your people into the fold, leading in a people-centric way.
What I'm hearing you say in all of this, and as a core belief, I really see that you believe in meeting the leader where they are with making the best choice that they can in that moment and taking into consideration things that maybe they haven't taken into consideration to date.
Absolutely. Which goes into the second question you had asked me. And so, by the way, just to go back to that, one of the other things, one of my other key phrases, you'll hear a few of them pop up, but you always hear me say is this useful? Because I never want to be in the position of telling somebody they should do something just because I think it's right. I do have very strong opinions about what I think is right, but that doesn't mean the person on the other side of the desk from me thinks it's right. I want to talk to them to get them to think about what's useful. Again, both in the short term and the long term. Because people many times come to me, again, as you can imagine, I'm sure you see, with like long held practices that they think are the right way to do things.
Right.
And if I tell them you shouldn't because that's not right, my listeners, I'm pushing my fists together. Like it's going to be conflict again. That's not a great approach. The best approach is what's the most useful way to do it.
Well, and that's very much the difference between like having a coaching hat on and having a mentorship, or, it's a very different way of supporting people.
Yeah.
It was just empowering them to make the choices and come to their own conclusions.
Absolutely. So one of the other things that is a very core belief of mine, I know you and I have talked about this, and this is where I diverge from much of the leadership training community. There's a phrase that gets thrown around a lot in leadership training that I don't find to be especially useful. To go back to that framework, and that is the phrase leadership style, or the concept of leadership style. For those who aren't familiar, a lot of people will tell you, Tosca, you should figure out what your leadership style is. You should figure out the way you like to lead and the way you feel comfortable leading. And that's you. Then you can go around telling people, this is my leadership style. This is how I do it. In my experience, and I was trained that way too early on, and I trained people like that early on, and it didn't work. The reason it doesn't work is because leadership defines influencing somebody else, not you, right? If I'm working with you, Tosca, and I say, well, my leadership style is this, but it doesn't influence you to move, then
Right.
I'm not a very good leader for you. It's as simple as that, right? So I can talk about my leadership style and talk about the way I'm comfortable doing things all day. But if it isn't useful in helping somebody move from point A to point B, it's not the right question to ask. So I would say, what is my leadership style is not the best question. The best question is what works for the person in front of you. And then have the ability to adapt and give them what they need to move forward.
Well, and that's very much in line with how I talk about influencing others, which is around centering the audience, which is around deeply understanding the other person so that you know how you can show up and you know the journey that you have to take with them because you've stopped to actually pay attention to what's going on in their world or be empathetic to what's happening with them so that you can show up in support and in a way that they can hear you, in a way that they can receive what you have to say. So, yeah, I'm all about ripping up the old playbooks, Brian. I mean, like we're changing the world here, right? Yeah, one step at a time.
Yeah, and I could throw one more thing in there. And again, I say this with all the kindness and empathy in my heart, and not judging anybody, but I found, I know there's a few others who feel like this. Like people who do what I do, there's almost this like inserted complexity, right? So like the more complex I can make this chart, the smarter I look, right? If I can tell you there's 23 steps to do this, well, you better hang around for 23 weeks then. So there's like this manufactured complexity to make things more difficult than they need to be. And that may or may not be intentional as a business strategy. It may be just somebody who hasn't really, I think it is many times intentional as a business strategy. Other times it may be somebody who just hasn't, measured the results far enough. But I think at the end of the day, these concepts are fairly straightforward.
Yeah. I always say it's simple, but it's not easy.
Exactly.
Yeah. Yeah. But yeah, we gotta write a book together on leadership. What's
That'd
happening?
be great.
Yeah, no, but I appreciate you sharing that because it what you're talking about is being a people-centric leader who leads others that love to follow. And that comes down to our humanity and our shared humanity and how we're showing up for each other and for ourselves. And like it doesn't, like you said, it can be simple. It doesn't have to be this 12-step, all these, trademarked words and all this
Yeah,
stuff.
exactly. That being said, there definitely is, I think, a framework to doing this, and I have a framework too. But I've done my very best, and I'm continuing to do it. Like this is not done. Like this is my purpose is like to distill this into the simplest form because that's what works.
Well, what's funny is that I have been resistant to write like the here's the 3-step thing or here's the acronym thing. But at the same time, like that is helpful for people. It is helpful. Like I have to get out of my own way with this sometimes because I'm just like, well, it's situational and da 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 da. But there are principles that are helpful, especially when you're stuck or you don't know what to do to come back to those basics And that's what I love about the point to point framework. So I'd love to, let's jump into that if you're ready to say, what is the point to point framework and how can folks use it starting today to be an even more effective leader?
So, all right, let's run through it real quick. I also want to throw in another point, if I could, just to
Of course.
frame this. There's another quote I always think about when I talk about this. And I don't use a lot of sports analogies because not everybody is a sports fan, but I think almost anybody can get this. There's a famous football coach years ago named Bill Parcells.
The Bills, right? I did grow up in Rochester, New York, and there is some familiarity.
Yeah, he coached almost every team in the Northeast at one point. But he's a famous Hall of Fame coach. And at one point, he had a very good team on paper. He had a very good team on paper. He has already had legendary status as a coach. His team was expected to win the Super Bowl, but they'd started out the year very poorly. They lost more games than they had won. And a reporter once asked him in a press conference, Bill, listen, we know you're a great coach. We know you've got all these talented players. You're better than your one-loss record says you are, aren't you? Like, you're better. Your team is better than that. And he wasn't buying it. He said, listen, you are what your record says you are, right? You can come here and tell me how great of a leader I am. You can tell my players how great they are. But the truth of the matter is we've won 2 games and lost 5. So we're not very good. You are what your record says you are. And if we want to be as good as we think we are, we better find a way to turn that into results.
Yes. Mic drop. I love that.
So when I talk about leadership, I always say this, you are what your record says you are. When I talk about the point-to-point framework, why? Because you are what your record says you are. Anybody can type in leader on their LinkedIn profile, right? Anybody, you can make up a business card with it. You can do whatever you want with it. But the bottom line is, have you helped people move from point A to point B systematically? Because when you can do that, you are a leader. You are what your record says you are. So this point-to-point framework is really just a way that I have found to help people do that.
I am so with you. I'm hanging on your every word. That's why I was like not saying anything. Because I'm like, he's on a roll. Come on, Rollo. Let's do it.
All right. Yeah, good. All right. So point-to-point framework really is 2 acronyms, both for point. One is like the way I was when I had that conversation with Kimberly, like the less useful state. This is also where I find many people I work with, and I'm first starting working with them. Usually they're not all of these things, but there's some of them. And the first acronym for like the less useful way is when people lead in a way that is procedural. In other words, every company has to have procedures, Tosca, but procedures aren't leadership, right? Me saying, here's the rule book, go do it, is not leadership. Allowing the rule book sort of to lead people is what I would call overly procedural leadership. The next phase there is overscheduled, too busy to lead. If you do that, that leads to the next one many times, which is leaders start to feel isolated. They feel isolated because they're not having conversations with their people. Maybe they're not even seeing their people perform. And they're hearing about the success secondhand, but not really seeing it up close and not really understanding the motivations, the challenges, and the wins of the people that they lead. By the way, one of the worst things there is missing the wins. It's one thing to miss the challenges. One of the worst things you can ever do is not notice when somebody does a great job.
Yes.
And that's one of the downfalls of being in this isolated state. I once coached a senior leader who cared about his people, loved the company, never got out of his office. Right? He'd come in at 8 a.m, sitting there. They'd see him again at 5 on the way out. It wasn't because he didn't care, but he'd sort of overscheduled himself into this way where he became isolated. He thought the procedures will do the work. And this wall started to appear between him and the people he led. So that's what I'm talking about with the isolated. That leads into leadership that is nominal. In other words, it's in name only. Somebody could go ask that gentleman who had great intentions, are you leading these people? He'd say yes, but if you ask them, they would probably say no, because it's in name only. He's got this title, but it's not really helping anything. And that brings to the final state there, which it all feels transactional, right? If he does talk to me, it feels transactional. He has to do it. I have to do it. There's a performance review I have to show up for. He's calling me in because I didn't do something right. It all feels very like, let's just get this over with. Which again, you think about this almost sums up the state I was in, like I told you when I went to go talk to Kimberly, which is just not useful.
Yes, I love this. So I just want to, for the listener here, I just want to recap on this one side of the point to point. And I know you're going to talk about the other point that's actually leadership, right? Which is procedural. The P is procedural. The O over schedule. I isolated. N nominal. And T transactional. And the big kind of message that I got when you were walking through that is this feels like a very time scarcity way of leading. It feels very time pressured and not spacious at all. And I don't know if you see it that way.
Absolutely. The overscheduled part is a huge part of this.
Yeah.
So one of my go-to phrases is that if you are a leader and part of your responsibility, again, I'm talking about business here. I think people can apply this in all different areas of life, but if we're going to talk about specifically business, like if you are a leader and that's important to you, your calendar should reflect it. Because what I hear many times is, Brian, I would like to be talking to my people. I'd like to be finding about their challenges and their wins, but I'm just so busy.
Yeah. And this is, look, we all know the patriarchy, the industrial age, all the things that drive us to feel like more is more is more. And we are just indoctrinated into this. You just can't stop. We move to exhaustion, hence the burnout, all the things where this is a big culprit. And for those also in creative worlds, and even myself, right, as a major producer of content at the end of the day to help people, right, to move forward and get unstuck in their career, I need spaciousness in my calendar to create, to actually excavate the knowledge that I have that will help other people. And if I'm overscheduled, if I have no space to process, then how can I be of best service? So sorry, just getting on a soapbox, but I think now I'm like, okay, Brian, how do you do that? Because this is so deeply embedded in what we're taught to do, especially in corporate environments, which I think extends as even as, so many people leave corporate now more than ever, right? Gig economy, all that stuff. But those ways of thinking and ways of leading stick with us well into the entrepreneurial journey, which is a lot of unlearning and undoing. So please.
So, yeah, and this is like time and time again. This is my work with people, especially in the beginning. If I'm in a coaching program, like this is week 2 or 3, maybe week 1, we're talking about this because a lot of times, most of the people I talk have great intentions. Otherwise, they wouldn't be engaging with me, right? They'd say, I don't need to do this. They're coming to me or their company's coming to me and saying, hey, Jane needs help. And like we try to figure out why, and almost always overscheduled is part of it. So I think the solution, again, to your point, simple, not easy, is you have to realize the importance versus the urgency. Go back to the Eisenhower matrix, what's important, what's urgent. Talking to the people on your team, actually having communication, in my experience, is about the most important thing you can do if you're a leader. Because when you don't, all these other bad things are downstream ramifications of it, right? How many times people say, listen, our people are a top priority. My people are the most important thing, but they're not feeling it because to them, you working on the reports is more important. To them, you going to these meetings is more important. To them, you going to talk to clients is more important because that's what your schedule reflects. So first of all, it's just understanding the importance of leading in a way that engages people, like the importance of being present. And then it's as simple as putting it on the calendar, which is we'll get out the calendar, we'll put it on there. And if we have to take some things off, we will, that are more urgent than important. But it's getting them on the calendar, and then we'll fit in other things around that.
Yeah, makes sense. It's like really, really aligning what you actually believe with what you're actioning. And that's where I'm hearing that first stage being.
Yeah, and I get it. Like everybody's there. To your point, you're there, I'm there sometimes. Like this is part of the world we live in that,
Yeah.
And we can trick ourselves. This is going to be a whole other thing, which probably, I'm sure you have guests that could just talk about this, but we can trick ourselves to thinking overscheduled means efficient.
Right.
That overscheduled means successful. I must be doing a great job because I'm so busy. Again, especially in a leadership position, that is deadly because you are going to start to be separated from the very people you need to influence.
Yeah. Listener, are you letting it in? This is the something different, right? Like this is the something different that really can unlock everything. So what I hear you say is in the second point of what to do then. If it's not procedural, for example, then what are we moving to?
Yeah. So from procedural, we're going to move to people-centric.
Makes sense. It's just what you talked about.
Leading by procedure, right, is listen, here's the policy, go do it. By the way, the problem with that, and again, from a business standpoint, I'm not saying companies should not have policies and procedures. Like we need those things, right? But those things are not leadership. And in isolation, I don't know about you, Tosca, but I found people who invented ways to follow a procedure while still not really doing what they're supposed to be doing in the big picture.
Right. Yeah. There's
Right?
always
There's ways to game the system.
Right.
People centric is simply, again, we probably should define that. It means, yes, I'm leading a way that people are most important, but it also means, to what we talked about earlier, I'm adapting my approach based on the person in front of me.
Right.
I'm not saying this is how I am, you better follow. I'm saying, all right, Tosca's here, and I can tell this is really important to her. This is what motivates her. How can I help? That's what people-centric is.
Yes.
The other one is from overscheduled to on purpose. On purpose, again, is just sort of the question I gave you, or the answer I gave you before. It is making sure we are making leadership happen. So if I go back to the example of the CEO I worked with, terrific guy, by the way, but when I asked him, he was the one that's stuck in his office all the time. I said, well, are you talking to the people on your team? Are you talking to the people that are most important to you? He said, well, sure. I said, well, when? He says, well, I see him in the hall sometimes or in the break room, and we run into each other and we chat then. Great. That's fine. But is it on purpose? No, it was random, right? And in fact, he'd almost outsourced the leadership part of it because he wasn't leading that process. He just accepted it would happen when it happened. And because of that, again, he was not getting the results he needed. So on purpose simply means, listen, I'm the leader here. Again, by definition, that means I'm the one to take action. That means I'm the one that's going to step up and make this happen. I'm not depending on the other person to do it, or depending on fate or the phase of the moon or whatever. Like I'm the person that's responsible for making this happen.
Yeah, and I look at that. I use the word intentional a lot, like what's your intent? And basically being conscious about your choices and not letting your schedule run you, but you saying, what is actually the choice that I want to make here? So I love this on purpose. Absolutely. It can change. I think this alone can change everything. Like just being aware of the choices that you're making. And are you just, playing to the beat of the drum that's been going on forever and ever? Or are you making choices that honor what you're trying to achieve?
Yeah. And again, we'll probably come back to this, but I'll tell you and your listeners, like if you are in any leadership role, or especially a formal one, like just if you're not doing it, just the act of having on purpose, regular, strategic, sincere, scheduled conversations will change everything. Like you can't help but get better if you do those things.
Yes.
If I defined anything that changed the people I work with that is more successful, like the people who really succeed versus the people who still struggle a little bit at the end, it's their willingness to commit to having these on purpose conversations.
Yes. And that requires some bravery. It requires some vulnerability, especially if part of those conversations are feedback opportunities or truly listening versus talking at the other person. And I think that the more we do, the more we get comfortable with that.
Yeah, so let's go. Exactly. You nailed it. So if I can go back to the Kimberly story again, right, that I told at the beginning of this podcast. Looking at it now, Tosca, I didn't mess up really in that conversation. I messed up a month, a year, 2 years before because I should have seen that coming, right? I should have seen it coming. And I look at it now and say, yeah, of course. I mean, I knew her well enough a little bit to know, like anybody, she has buttons and triggers that people can push, right? I should have been way more intentional in preparing her for that moment when somebody was going to push that button and she was going to want to respond poorly. If I had been doing this, again, a week, a month, a year ahead of time, we never would have got there, which is why I'm so passionate now. Like I always say, kill the monsters when they're small, right?
Yes.
Kill the monsters when they're small. Get ahead of these things. Dedicate time to these conversations. Figure out what the person in front of you needs. Figure out like what's the button that somebody's going to push, because we all have them. And then coach them. And how do they separate response from impulse, right? When this happens, how can I help you get ahead of that? So when that moment comes, you're going to respond in a way that's useful to you and the people around you, not harmful. So that's really the genesis of this whole thing, but especially the on purpose part. Invest time in these conversations now. It's going to save you down the road.
Yes. And I just love all of this. Oh my gosh. And I think that sometimes we can feel like, oh, we're being nitpicky, or oh, we have these like perfectionist expectations in leading, and huge watch outs there. But to your point, right, when we see something, if you see something, say something, right? But like these little moments, these little teachable moments, these little seeing the trends and seeing the threads and not ignoring them and saying, yeah, like what's the risk of continuing to do this thing? What's the risk of continuing to ignore that thing? And having those conversations, like you said, when the monster is small, and you can prevent some things down the line. I love that.
Yeah. And the thing is, if you haven't been doing this, I always say, listen, don't expect people to come in and open their hearts to you in meeting one. Probably not going to happen. They might even fight you in meeting one and say,
Yes.
why do I have to do this? But you do it time and time again and again in a way that shows that you care about them. And this is to help them, not to help you. Over time, if you build that trust, it will become very easy to see with most people what is going to help them get better and what you need to coach them through, because it could potentially be dangerous for them.
That's such an important point that you made, right? Because there's going to be skeptics. Because if you come in and you haven't necessarily been that people centric leader, and then all of a sudden you're asking people how they're doing, they're going to be like, what's that all about? What does he want from me? Or, like that is real, like rebuilding trust and
Yeah.
teaching people who you're becoming. Like that is a process. And so, yeah, you may get some pushback, you may get some resistance, but keep going, because once they see that you're for real, like, yeah, you're going to win over hearts and minds that way for sure.
Yeah. What always happens to me, Tosca, is like if I get a manager or an executive who hasn't been doing this,
Mhm.
like people are terrified to go in the office, you know?
Yes.
Or I worked with Tosca. Tosca goes in the office. They're like, oh my God, what did she do? Right? There's all
Yes.
this fear that's wrapped up into it because up until now, it's never happened, usually, unless something bad's going on. So you do have to start small. You have to build that trust. But two, three, four conversations in, like you will start to build trust with people if you approach it the right way, which maybe is going to get to the rest of what we're going to talk about here. But it's important to realize that it is a process for sure.
Yes. All right. So keep us going here. So we went from the people centric to the O of point, which is on purpose. What comes next?
The next is inquiring. So that means this is all going to be question based. These conversations are all going to be based around Tosca, what's going on with you? Tosca, can you share a win? Tosca, what challenge is going on? Right? And I've got a whole, if your listeners want, maybe I can give it to you. I've got a whole agenda that people can use. And also like a good thing, a good phrase to say and a bad phrase to say. But you're going to ask questions to really try to get to the heart of what's going on with this person. What do they love? What's challenging them? What's pushing their buttons? Who's pushing their buttons? What can I reward them for? We want to ask really good questions to try to understand them.
Oh, yes. We definitely want to share the resource and how people can get your content. And I know we'll do all of that also at the end. But right now, how can they get that resource that you just mentioned?
I'll give it to you. You can put a link in the show notes if you want. Or
Perfect.
they can message me on LinkedIn if they want. I'm easy to find there, or whatever we want to do. But yeah, I'll make that available to you on both of those things. So people find them to be really the same thing as I give to my clients. So people find them to be very helpful.
Amazing. Oh my gosh. Very generous. Yeah. See, I told you he was generous. So we will have all those links in the show notes for sure.
And so then the N is the downstream effect of that. It's needs based, which means I've asked questions, I'm going to listen, and then I'm customizing my approach on what the person in front of me needs. I'm not saying this is my leadership style, so this is what I'm going to do. I'm saying, all right, Tosca, it sounds like you need ABC. Maybe I'm not saying those words out loud. Maybe I am, depending on the situation. But I'm going to customize my approach to what the person in front of me needs, which may be different than what I would need, maybe different than what somebody else on the team needs. But I'm gonna customize. Do we have time for one other quick story on that I can give you?
Yes. Yes.
So I always think about this when I get to this point. I was working with somebody once. She was actually a fairly high up executive in a company, but the CEO that she had in that company, she could not deal with. She felt he was a micromanager. That's the term she used. I have some issues with that word itself, only because I think, again, it can be misapplied. But certainly, he was not giving her the autonomy she felt she needed. It got to the point where she felt like she had to change jobs. So she quit She went to another company. This new boss was perfect for her. He just said, hey, Susie, go do it. She would go do it. She'd tell him it was done. It was great and it worked perfectly. The funny thing is, she talked to one of her colleagues. She said, isn't this CEO great? He gives us all this space. She said, I don't think he's great at all. He never talks to me. He never checks in. I don't think he likes me at all. I don't think I can keep working here. Right? Same CEO interpreted two totally different ways by the people on his team because they're human beings that needed different things from him. And so if you're stuck with like one trick, right, you're going to lose people who that doesn't work for again. So needs-based is just saying, hey, this CEO, if I was coaching him, he should figure out that this person needs autonomy. This other person craves connection and reinforcement. And I'm going to give the person who needs space, and I'm going to be checking in on the person who needs connection. Not that difficult, but if you don't go into that mind frame, it's very easy to alienate people, and you will alienate people.
Yes, I love that story. It's so, yeah, it so exemplifies what you're saying. It's not about your leadership style. It's about honoring what people need and how you can provide that with oftentimes minimal effort. It's just about being aware of what will be best supportive.
Yeah, absolutely. And so that brings us to the T, which is just transformational as opposed to transactional. So what I have found, if you do these things, you lead in a way that's people-centric, on purpose, inquiring, needs-based, is you will create transformation. And again, we can just define transformation as taking somebody who is in that less optimal state, point A, we're going to move them to point B. We're going to transform. They're going to transform. And you're going to be able to help them say you did it. I would say when it works best, it looks like a magic trick, Tosca. It's like somebody pulled a rabbit out of a hat because this person was this and now they're this. This team was this and now they're this. And people look around and say, wow, Tosca's a great leader because she made this happen. Isn't she amazing? And you are amazing when you do this, but it's because you're following these steps.
Yes, I love that because I feel like what you're talking about, these steps, there is so much magic that comes from this. The magic in finding that connection versus the transaction, the magic in people feeling differently about showing up to work and what they do. We can often look back and say, how was that created? I don't know if you do this for your clients too, but oftentimes I'm like, well, what do you think led to that result? And oftentimes they miss like, oh, I showed up differently. Like you have to like actually put a mirror up and say, actually, these steps that you've been taking is what led to this result that feels miraculous, but actually it's a little bit of 1 + 1 = 3, situation. At least that's how I see it.
Yeah, and you know what? It's okay if it looks like a magic trick to everybody else because we know the trick.
Right. Yes.
Right?
Yes. We get paid the big bucks to teach you the tricks. Yeah.
So, when I'm coaching somebody, I want their colleagues and their bosses to say, Tosca's amazing. Look what she did, right? They don't necessarily need to know all the grind that went in behind it. They may or may not, but we want them to see that transformation.
Yes. Oh my gosh. Look, you have shared so many amazing stories, inspiration from your own experiences, and true tools in the toolbox that I have no doubt the listener here is going to have a transformative moment just by listening to this, let alone taking action on something. And I think this is going to be one of those episodes that you want to listen to more than once because there was so much in it to take away and to reflect on in your own leadership and how you move through the world in your life and in your career. So thank you so much for that.
Well, thank you. And again, I want to stress that I think a lot of my work just does go to the business side of it. So that is what I do. But I hope that somebody could come in here and they're not a boss at all, but we all have results we're trying to generate. And one of the things I found, Tosca, is like none of us get where we're going alone, right? So that means we need people on our side. And eventually, if you get good enough at that, people are going to look to you for guidance. So one of the nicest things anybody ever said to me about my work was that it helped them with their kids. Which again, I never wrote it that way. I never wrote my book that way. I never did it this way. But that was one of the things that really, warmed my heart. And so I hope that somebody, if you've listened along all this time and you're not a boss of anybody or nobody gave you a title, I still think you can use this approach to help generate good things and the people around you. And so they will look to you as a leader and you can help them get better. And at the same time, you're going to help yourself.
I absolutely agree. And actually, one of the things I was thinking about as you were walking through your framework alone, let alone everything else we talked about, right? Is even as an entrepreneur, even a solopreneur, can take this and think about how would they apply this to their prospective client calls? How would you apply this to building relationships? Regardless of even if you're moving somebody from point to point, but just building something because maybe you don't even know what that point is that you're trying to get to, but building some trust and some possibility. So I absolutely think these are universal lessons and life skills. And of course we package it in leadership because that's what we do. But
Absolutely.
yeah, like I know we covered a lot of ground and I definitely want to make sure people know how to get in touch with you. But before we do that, is there anything else that you feel like, wow, we didn't talk about this, or this is something I really feel is important to say?
One more thing I would throw out there, and just because this comes out a lot, is this concept of authenticity. So, a lot of times when I'm talking to people about this, well, I can't remember if I shared this story with you, Tosca, when we were talking before. I was giving a workshop on this a while back, and somebody raised her hand and she said, "Well, Brian, all this stuff you're saying sounds good, but that's not authentic to me." I'm like, "Well, what do you mean by that?" She says, "Well, I'm the kind of person who just says what I think. If somebody is getting on my nerves, I tell them. If I think somebody's a jerk, I tell them." I'm like, "All right, how's that working for you?" She says, "Well, nobody will talk to me." but but that's who I am. That's who I am authentically. So it really made me think about authenticity and how it relates to this. And so if there's anybody else that's thinking like, "Brian, I would love to do this, but like I don't feel that's who I am." I found authenticity really is about being authentic in its truest form, being authentic to your values, not your approach, right? Be authentic to your values. Like if you value connection with people, if you value honesty, if you value integrity, if you value humor, whatever it is you value, be true to that. But realize sometimes you might need to vary up your approach to stay true to that value.
Yes.
Right. So this lady in the workshop, I don't think one of her values was to alienate people and be all alone. Right. That was
Right.
not a state, but that's what she had created. And in doing so, she was telling herself that she was being authentic, thus reinforcing something that was not working for her. So as I sort of roll out what might be for other people, some people, a new way to think about this, I would just throw that out there too. If part of you is thinking, well, that's not who I am, be authentic to your values. But if you'd like to make things better, be flexible in your approach to living those values.
Ooh, mic drop moment right there, Brian. And I love that you brought this to the table. One of the things that I say around this is we've been conditioned to do what we do, but that doesn't mean that is, to your point, aligned to our values. So, really questioning, well, why am I doing this thing? And it's not who you are in so many respects. It's how you've been taught or how you've been conditioned to do things a certain way. And that might be your thoughts and that might be your actions.
Well, yeah, we could talk another hour about this, which we don't have.
I
But
know, I
yeah, but
know.
yeah, we tell each other. It's funny how we can allow, again, we can allow things that have happened to us to tell ourselves a story about how we need to behave in the future. And
Yes.
before long, we're trying to make this story we told ourselves about ourselves true, even if that is not the most useful thing to do.
Well, yeah. And on that note, because that's squarely in the work that I do too, right? Which is the narratives and how that impacts our choices and what we do. So,
You tell people about this, Tosca. I'm going to leave that to you.
no, yeah, I love it. It's such a full circle moment to me, right? Because leadership and how we've had this whole conversation just really comes down to, I think, really deep awareness of how you're showing up and what you're doing and the choices that you're making. I don't know. If I just kind of distilled it all down, like it's really just raising that awareness of what you're doing and how you're choosing to lead.
And being intentional. Exactly.
Yes.
Yeah, I'll leave it
Yes.
at that.
All right. So, how can folks get more of your juicy leadership tips? What's the best way that they can learn more from you and about you?
I will give you a link to those items. Also, there is a leadership assessment that I use. So I use it with clients, but it's also other people can take it. So I'd love to gift that to you. It's pretty cool. It'll be 12 questions, takes about 5 minutes. But using the principles we talked about today, you're going to get a customized assessment on your strengths and potentially growth opportunities. So that is totally free. And I'll give you the link to that as well. And then I would just welcome people. You can find me at brianrollo.com. But if you want to contact me, the best way is just to find me on LinkedIn. If you're on LinkedIn, I'd love for you to shoot me a message, say I heard you on Tosca, and tell me what you liked about the episode. I'd love to talk to anybody who listened and just hear how it resonated for you.
Amazing. And you have a newsletter as well, is that?
I do, yes.
Yes.
So if you go to my newsletter or go to my LinkedIn, you'll also see a newsletter. Would love people to get that. That goes out every Tuesday morning. In fact, probably going out as we speak, as we're recording on a Tuesday morning. But yes, that goes out every Tuesday morning. Would love people, if you like this, would like to hear more about how I think about different things like talent retention and personal growth and goal setting. I would love for you to sign up to my newsletter. You'll hear from me every week on that.
Amazing. So there's so many opportunities here. They're all going to be in the show notes. Thank you so much for your time, for your energy, your passion, and helping us all be better leaders and show up better, not only for ourselves, but for the future that we want to create. It's been such a pleasure to have you on the Unlock Lab. And who knows, maybe there'll be a part 2. We'll talk about authenticity and leadership.
Thank you, Tosca. I'm thrilled to be here.
Thank you. And thanks to the listeners for sticking in on this one. And ciao for now.